Hello, everyone. How are you? My name is Max Owre. I see some friends here are already coming on board. Good to see everybody today. First of all, I'd like to don't be alarmed. I had an accident with my fork this morning. That's not true. There's never a convenient time to be in the public face and have a dermatological appointment in the morning. So if you'll excuse the patches, I'd put them over my eye and be a pirate if I could. Welcome, everybody, to Lunch with Friends and Strangers, our funnest program, the one where we get to meet new people, maybe people, and also, of course, spend some time with some of our great faculty. Before I begin, I want to start with a few thank yous. I want to thank our sponsors, the Cotton Merca Group, Carolina Meadows, the North Caroliniana Society, and of course, our partner in much of our programming, the General Alumni Association. I also want to make a few important points for scheduling. Normally, this program is on Friday at 12, like we are today, but our next program with Heidi Kim will be on March 30th. This is next Wednesday at March 31st on, I hope I have the date right, but Wednesday at 12 o'clock. And of course, you've seen it on the slideshow we had going around. And that is because university is closed next Friday. I also want to remind folks about one very important thing. If you are interested in helping Carolina Public Humanities with our public mission, a lot of our programs for teachers and community colleges and our special events are free, of course. We don't charge for those. If you would like to help us, we have Give UNC coming up on Tuesday. This is odd to ask for money and say, don't give us money now. But please consider giving on Give UNC Tuesday, and I'll find the link for that and put that up. You'll also notice, and one thing I also want to say is I am flying solo today. So normally my colleague Paul Bonici is behind the scenes doing all sorts of incredible stuff. I want to thank Paul for getting us set up today and getting us ready to go. But if I'm not as quick as getting things into the chat box, that's because I don't have as capable hands behind the scenes. I also want to thank Vicki Breeden, Brian Ensminger for getting everybody on board here today. Welcome. We can see let's first of all welcome our friend, Dr. Victoria Rovine. Welcome. And from here on out, it's going to be Vicki, okay? There we go. Great. So Vicki, welcome. We're so delighted to have you. And this is a first for us. As you know, we have something very different. We normally in our biography series are talking about people. This is our first object biography. And Vicki, why don't you show us the object that we're going to be looking at today? Our stranger is probably no stranger to you, but you're going to learn a lot about this stranger today.
So, okay. Everybody see that? Is that good?
Yeah, we can see it. So our guest, our stranger is none other than the Pith Helmet. So what does this picture tell us about some of the big ideas that we should be thinking about when we think about the Pith Helmet?
Sure. I mean, first, thanks, Max, and thanks to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
The audience. I want to specify that I'm an art historian. I work in West Africa, in Mali. Mali was a French colony called the Sudan Français, and I'm a clothing and textiles person. That's what I've always worked on and written about. I've written 2 books on clothing and textiles in West Africa and elsewhere in Africa. But I became fascinated by the Pith Helmet in my current project, which is looking at France and the Sudan Français, what is today Mali, through cotton. Cotton is the focus of the book that I'm working on, but I got sort of waylaid into the Pith Helmet because the Pith Helmet is this emblem, fascinating emblem of French colonial power, just as it is an emblem of other colonial powers like Britain for the most part. But in West Africa, I saw all these pieces of evidence that West Africans were taking and transforming and making use of the Pith Helmet in their own way, just as they were adapting French clothing styles and textiles, but making them their own. I'm really interested in these kinds of ideas, how things travel and how ideas change and how forms reflect these changing ideas. So this image is my sort of starting point in some of the work that I've been doing. This is a very famous French ethnographer named Marcel Griel, famous and notorious. And this is one of his colleagues on a big trip that he made in 1931 all the way across Africa. It was really famous. It was heralded in France. And here they are in what is today Mali. They're at a shrine. And they are, this photograph is sort of prototypically colonial, the way we see, and so-called, I have scare quotes here, exotic piece of architecture. We have the two white male protagonists here, Marcel Griel and Michel Leary. And in the background are the people from this community. They are literally in the margins, in the background. And when we read Marcel Griol's accounts, it's all about the power that he wielded and his ability to force people in the communities where he worked to hand over masks and figures and other works of art. As an art historian, it's pretty unsettling, to say the least, to learn about how objects that are now in the famous Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, which is the museum for people who study African art. Well, how did they get there? Marcel Griel and his machinations. It was a prime supplier. So the pith helmets here are part of his power. He, in this moment, was asking for the people in this community called Kemeni to give him a mask that he wanted, a specific type of mask that we study as art historians. And they wouldn't give it up. It didn't matter what he offered them. He wouldn't give it up. We know from this man, Michel Leary, who recorded this event, that Marcel Griel threatened them and said he would arrest them all and take them to the colonial office in a nearby town, and they'd all be arrested and fined. And then they stole the mask anyway.
And the reason he can say that is because the power that's sort of inherent in wearing that pith helmet and coming in as the white man with the pith helmet. The pith helmet, I assume, is often associated with this military aspect of force and control. And so he himself is not a soldier, but it's coming in with that coercive element.
Right. In fact, he was a former soldier, which was part of his whole persona. But he was deliberately confusing the division between different categories of French people and essentially acting like he was the same as the French military forces, right? So the pith helmet is part of the ability to make that sort of elision, to say, hey, you have to do what I say because I'm the same as the colonial authorities, right? So then, should I go? I can just.
Well, let me just ask you a question here. Let me ask you about just, I know that we talked to this in our preliminary discussions, that the origins are not entirely known, but could you hint a little bit some of what we talked about and what the material is and just what exactly is a pith helmet?
Right. So let me skip ahead if you all don't mind me leaping
Nope,
forward.
that's fine.
Let's see. No, that's not the one I want. Sorry, it's this one. So the pith helmet, we don't know exactly what its origins are. I've been doing research on this and it's not clear. But it may be that this helmet, which the word pith refers to sort of certain trees that have a lining of a type of wood, a very lightweight porous wood underneath the bark of the tree. And hats were made of this. And the idea was that this would prevent the strength of the sun's rays from damaging your health. And that's what I think most of us think of when we think of a pith helmet. It's a sun.
And it is white, so it's reflecting sunlight.
White, it's reflective, exactly. And it's made in a way, this is from 1903. It's a sort of a treatise about, it's called Colonial Hygiene. And this is a wonderful work that really dramatizes the fear of the sun of the tropics, the visceral fear. The sun was treated as a mortal enemy, very literally a mortal enemy. You took off your pith helmet for 5 minutes, even if the sun wasn't out. If you were a white person, it was believed that you could die, instantly die. Your brain would just fry. So the pith helmet was created as a way to adapt to the colonies. And people, Europeans, French people who were traveling to the colonies were told, get that pith helmet out the moment your boat comes anywhere near the shore of West Africa or Central Africa, depending on where you were going, and do not take it off your head until you're back home in France, essentially. So it was made of pith covered with a white fabric. This is a hole at the top, and you see the hole is covered here. This is kind of a classic pith helmet. They come in many forms. And also the idea was that there was a space that was sort of empty, that air could circulate in between sort of the hat and your head. So it was sort of lifted up off your head to allow air to circulate beneath your head. and it may well have been effective. I mean, one
Yeah.
should wear a hat in the bright sun, but it was the degree to which it was effective was richly exaggerated
Yeah.
in the discourse around serving in the colonies.
And it's interesting what you said there about sort of making sure that everybody who went there, that's also sort of self-reinforcing the power, right? You know, every European who gets off the boat is wearing these helmets. Now they might be wearing it because they're responding to hygiene here or whatnot, but
Right.
the effect of seeing that is like, you know, all of these Europeans are wearing this representation of power, right?
Mhm.
Very interesting. So, in terms of manufacture of them, do you have a sense of where they like most of the French were getting them? Where were they being made? Were they being manufactured in France for people to then go over, or
I
any
believe they
sense?
were being manufactured in France, but I haven't looked in detail
Okay,
at that. Yeah, but there were manufacturers in Britain, in France,
yeah.
and all different parts of the
And
world.
I'm sure if you got off the boat, there were plenty of people ready to sell you one right away if you did not have one already.
No doubt, no
Somewhere.
doubt.
That's very
Absolutely.
fascinating.
Yeah.
So, you know, what I'm really curious about here is are there other elements of clothing that you've looked at that are associated with power, or what makes the helmet in particularly a different way of, clearly a military uniform is one way of projecting power.
Mhm.
Was Western dress in itself a symbolic of power in any
Um,
way?
yeah, yes, it was, but it wasn't specific to the colonial context. What I find interesting in the pith helmet is that it represents the colonial context specifically, both
Yeah,
in the colonies and in France. So in France, to wear the pith helmet was to evoke the exotic mystique of the distant colonies. To wear it in the colonies was to evoke France, right? So it's
yeah.
sort of this interesting back and forth. It evokes the distant other no matter where it is,
Oh, that's
right?
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll
It-
show you here this just one of about 1 billion examples one could use to show the deliberate association of the pith helmet with the colonies in the sort of massive popular culture and mass media promotion of the colonies in France. So this
yeah,
was produced in France to promote joining the colonial forces,
yeah,
right? So a French military force that was specific to the colonies. And so we have this, classically apple-cheeked French, healthy, strapping young French soldier wearing this dramatic white. To me, whiteness is important. The whiteness of the helmet
yeah,
set off against the deep blue of this sea, right? So
yeah.
holding up this placard which
Yeah.
lists
Young
all of
men,
the
come,
advantages.
if you're wondering what to do with your life, come to the
Right,
colonies. Yeah, I've
exactly.
seen these before. What's
Right.
interesting about this picture as well, Vicky, if you notice, like it's all the imagery in the background is, of course, talking to the vast diversity of France's empire, right? We have what looks like some sort of maybe from Vietnam, a pagoda, or China, something Asian. And so clearly the idea is that, the one constant through all of this is the as you said, the fair-faced, pith helmet wearing young man who can go on these long journeys and always be recognized as French, no matter where he goes.
Right, right. And the colonies are also not coincidentally represented by women.
Yeah. Oh, very. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Good
this is
point.
probably Central Africa. This looks like West Africa, North Africa, and then Indochina. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly.
Very interesting.
So yeah, it feels like pounding you on the head if you look back at it now. But at the time, I suppose it could have subtly slipped. It just you absorb the idea of the exotic other as female, and French forces were the masculine, the male, the rulers, right? So this is part of what I'm interested in, is how this deliberate connection and association was made, and then how it slips from the control of the French who created the connection,
Yeah.
and
Well,
West Africans.
let's get to that. Let's get to the appropriation by West Africans, pointing it back. Let's get to that in just one moment. I'm going to shut the screen for a second. I want to ask a little bit about. Let me see if I can ask you to unshare your screen.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
There we go. I want to ask you a little bit about just in general in fashion and in France itself. we know that during the 1920s there was a great fascination. As an aside, if anyone doesn't know, so I teach French colonialism, so this is a real treat for me to be able to talk about some of these topics. But there was some tension between sort of an assimilationist approach to the French colonies and a sort of turn in the 1920s to appreciate the diversity of the colonies, what we might call an associationist kind of approach. And I always tell my students, these two things are always in conflict with each other in terms of it's never clear cut whether it's an associationist idea or assimilationist. But in the 1920s, we see this fascination. This is the era of the Musée de l'Homme. This is the era of bringing in all of these ideas. So how are colonial ideas being brought into French society, into French fashion, and in France itself, looking at this? Again, we're going to go back to West Africa for sure, but can you speak a little bit to it, to the Pith Helmet and to even colonial fashion in the home country, if you will?
Right, right. Well, it's this sort of promotion of the colonies, this sort of tension between assimilation and association is visible in the Pith Helmet in terms of, I would say, one thing comes to mind, which is how the French responded to their colonial subjects wearing the Pith Helmet. There are contexts which are assimilationists, where it's appropriate for somebody from the colonies to wear the Pith Helmet. That can be with the official sort of, we might say, permission, with the support of the French colonial administration. That's assimilationist. That's saying, we're going to assimilate you, we're going to make you French. And then there's this distancing, which is in between the wars, really, in the 1920s and 30s, where there's this sort of official, how shall I put it, rejection of the notion that the colonial subject can ever become French. So we might as well emphasize their exoticism, distance them from ourselves, right? They should take pride in their difference from us, whereas just a decade earlier, it was, you should be French, right?
Yeah.
So then we see examples of West Africans wearing the Pith Helmet that are that create dismay. The reaction in the French press is dismay and sort of treating those West Africans who dare to wear the Pith Helmet as it's incredibly inappropriate, right? There needs to be a distancing. They shouldn't be wearing our insignia of power.
It's
so
an interesting discourse about how the French suddenly became proud of their multicultural empire, and look at how we can embrace all of these people. They can still be in the fold of France, but we're not trying to turn them into French because we can celebrate this. And of course, this is a thorny subject for France in its entire 19th and 20th century history, is its inability to actually be multicultural. Or and embrace that. But at the same time, in the colonies, they're celebrating this. I want to look a little bit. I might share the screen because I have your images up as well. I just want to pull this one up. But this is clearly, we're looking at Vogue magazine here, right?
Right. So in 1931, you could say, was the apotheosis, right? The height of French imperial celebration of their status as colonial power. In 1931, some of you may be familiar with, there was a gigantic exposition, sort of a multimedia fair, carnival, scientific sort of symposia and music and dance, all about France as colonial power. And there was an official agency in the French government whose job was to pump out information about the colonies so that it could be carried and promoted by popular culture sorts of media, like newspapers, magazines, theater. I have a whole section in my larger work on the Pith Helmet about Josephine Baker's very famous banana dance. Some of you may know this dance, that it was debuted in 1925 in Paris. She was wearing a string of fake bananas around her waist. You can imagine what you could do with bananas if you were a talented young dancer. She's African American, but she was celebrated as African in Paris, which is interesting. But people don't tend to talk about the other character. Well, there were two other characters in the dance, a Black man, I think he was from the Caribbean, who was her partner in the dance, and then a white colonial figure who was sleeping through most of her erotic dance, and he's wearing a pith helmet, which tells us who he is.
Mhm.
And then he is fascinated by her and mesmerized by her. So anyway, the point here is that the images you were just looking at, the Vogue magazine cover from 1931, is part of this deliberate effort to promote the colonies, essentially like a giant PR campaign.
Yeah,
And
and there are the
so we
pith
have,
helmets you can see even in
yeah.
this, So
So
yeah,
I love the Vogue cover, and there are lots of other, there's a whole host of other fashion related
well,
pith helmet. This is
this
great.
and tell us about this picture.
So this is from the very same issue, and it's a little vignette. I think it's a 2-page spread with this wonderful photograph. She's named, I don't remember her name, Madame Carillon or something. She's
Yeah,
a painter. She's an amateur painter and sort of a lady about town from France who goes on a tourist trip to West Africa. And she's with a friend of hers who looks rather uncomfortable standing on the little ferry, and her car is being pushed on a barge across a river, right?
yeah.
She stands in the water holding her skirt up, to her knees, tipping her pith helmet, looking very happy. This is like French colonial fashion. Women who were going to the colonies wanted to wear appropriate clothing. And in the little blurb next to the picture, it also notes that she's on her way to visit a, quote, cannibal village, which such things do not exist, did not exist. You
Yeah,
can imagine this is part of the exoticization of the
yeah.
colonies. So it's a
And,
wonderful image for all of these reasons.
and also just in general, noticing the contrast of dress and undress as well,
Mhm.
right? The Africans in the picture, the younger Africans are completely naked,
Mhm.
and others are in various states of undress. There's just sort of this notion of civilizational, and again, the big scare quotes, civilizational contrast, right? That's being portrayed there, not only in the text saying going to a cannibal village,
Right,
but just this image of, dressed, civilized, undressed, uncivilized,
right,
right?
very much so. Yeah.
Really fascinating stuff. And also I just think that colonial exhibition is remarkable in and of itself because of its, people, the accusation of sort of human zoos,
Oh,
bringing
yeah.
up actual, hey, look, this is how a dance is done in, in this particular ethnicity in West Africa. Um, this is also an era, as you know, and we talked about this, of great criticism of colonialism. The Communist Party that organized the anti-colonial exposition at the same time. Do
Right.
you see any? Do you see any reinforcement of? And I know we're going to look at some pictures of people that were critical of French colonialism. I'll let you share the screen for those. But can you speak about the relationship between colonialism and anti-colonialism and how it figures into this dynamic that we're discussing?
Yeah, I mean, most of the work for this project is by default the pro-colonial, uh, how shall I put it? The sort of discourse that was in favor of colonialism, because that's what I'm looking at how the French constructed this idea and then the West African response to the idea. But threaded through it all, you do have frequent um, responses to that, right? Both from French writers, journalists, visitors to the colonies responding to and seeing the truth of what was going on in the colonies, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah,
So
La
Lear,
Vérité sur la colonie was the name of that
yes, exactly, right,
exhibition. Yeah.
exactly, right. So Leary is such a fascinating character, the man who was standing next to Marcel Griel at
Mhm.
that shrine, because in his book, in fact, should I put up an image of that?
Sure.
Okay. Um, his book, L'Afrique Fantôme, which I'm looking for the cover of right now. This is the book that he published in 1934 that was scandalous because it was based on his diaries during that trip with Marcel Griel, the famous ethnographer, who was stealing and bullying the West Africans that they encountered. And in L'Afrique Fantôme, part of what I find really fascinating is Michel Leary describes not only what was really happening, but he describes the people that they encountered, including several West Africans. I have wonderful descriptions. I love this man's writing. He's a wonderful, famous, important writer. He describes meeting uh, prestigious African interlocutors, local chiefs, local businessmen who were interacting with the French as they traveled, several of whom wore pith helmets. And he describes them wearing pith helmets really vividly and wonderfully. Can I read, do you all,
Yeah,
can I
please,
read
please,
this?
let's go right
Yeah.
into it for sure.
Okay. So here, Michel Leary is describing meeting a district chief in the Sudan Francais in French West Africa. He says, quote, physically very tall and very slender with a handsome dark complexion, an entirely indigenous outfit, parentheses, a large dark blue bubu. A bubu is a big gown, a very elegant gown, and sandals, a little amulet wrapped in leather dangling on his chest. So entirely indigenous. And then he goes on, with the exception of a beige pith helmet worn with great distinction. So it's a very respectful, I don't have an image. I wish I had an image, but I don't. I do have an image that is someone who might sort of look like this district chief, but is not the district chief. Just a moment, here we go. And then I have another wonderful description. This man here, right?
Yeah.
I don't know who he is. I don't know that I'd be able to find out because I don't know exactly where this was taken.
Mhm.
But this is part of my cotton related research. This is
Yeah.
probably a French cotton broker or a local colonial official. These are filled with cotton. This part of
Yeah.
West Africa is a major cotton producer, and
Sure.
that's part of what the French were interested in. This is likely the owner of the land, the owner of the cotton fields, and his family. I'm imagining 2 wives, maybe 3 wives and his children. I don't know
Mhm.
exactly. But look at how, I think he looks wonderfully elegant. We can't see him
Yeah.
in detail.
And
But
so let me
yeah.
ask you a question about this. I mean, is this do we get the sense that the wearing of the pith helmet by distinguished people like this is not even necessarily a political statement of appropriation against the French, but simply adopting this idea of power? Like, you know, this is the symbolic idea of power that we wear. I'm in cahoots, if you will, with the leadership of these colonies, and I'm part of it.
Right, or not even in cahoots.
Yeah.
I'm a businessman in my own right.
Yeah.
I do
There you go.
business with them.
Yeah.
Sometimes you could say in cahoots, but it
Yeah.
is an
Poor
aspiration.
phrasing on my part. Poor phrasing on
Yeah,
my
that's
part.
okay.
But the point I meant was that they're
Yeah.
definitely associating themselves
Yeah.
with the same association of power is wearing the hat. You know.
Right, I agree. I think that's a good way to put it, to say not necessarily associating myself with the French, but associating myself with power, which
Yeah.
happens to be French at this point. But
Yeah.
there were others who served in the administration, West Africans, and they wore pith helmet as part of this sort of attire of the bureaucrat, the administrator, like that. This man here, I think, is more just sort of, hey, I'm wearing my elegant white boo-boo. And I think he's got a medal on his chest. I'm not sure.
Yeah. It looks
It
like
wasn't
it.
uncommon for the French to, if they had a relationship with a local person of power, they might give them some insignia of power.
Oh, sure.
And yeah, so he's wearing the pith helmet just as part of a full attire of power, which involves the boo-boo. He would not be, this man, no doubt, I'm guessing, wouldn't be caught dead in what the French were wearing, which was shorts, which would have been
Yeah.
very inappropriate for a man, unless
Yeah.
he was working in the field.
Mhm.
So this picture, it says a lot. There's a lot going on there, and I wish I knew exactly who they all were, but I don't.
That's a tremendous amount of cotton. I'll say that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
really,
yeah.
it's really remarkable. So,
Right.
this we're gonna, we want to get to thinking about the political legacy of the pith helmet. Because the pith helmet, it seems like the type of thing that a white person shouldn't wear. I mean, maybe. I mean, and what do you say about that in terms of the legacy? And then we can talk about how West Africans have turned the narrative around it. But what do you say about the political legacy of clothing in general? Is that a silly thing to say, or is clothing neutral? I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but to delve into this question a little bit about appropriate attire, clothing. We're in an age where we want to be very sensitive to cultural appropriation. This is perhaps a Western object. It's not culturally appropriating, but it's symbolic. Can you speak a little bit to the politics of clothing in the pith helmet?
Yeah, I mean, because the pith helmet was so deliberately associated with a certain kind of European power in non-European settings, it can't help but have those associations, right? It is no longer simply a practical piece of headwear because it's loaded with this history that's still attached to it. So yes, clothing is always political, of course it is, whether deliberately or not. And so wearing a pith helmet evokes that history. And depending on the context that you're in, that might be appropriate or very, very inappropriate, right?
Yeah.
This also evokes another kind of common neo-colonial association, is the out of Africa kind of phenomenon. The Isaac Dinesen book, based on her experience in Kenya, but then that was sort of repopularized with the movie, whenever that movie came out with Robert Redford and Meryl Streep. And then there was an explosion of fashion sort of reverberations, the out of Africa style. And that continues today when you have, you know, people making music videos or whatever that involve that style of jodhpurs and white shirt and pith helmet. That is often attacked as a neo-colonialist kind of provocation, whether the artist involved meant it or not. I could show one picture to make that point.
Yeah, I think we need to see the picture. Yeah. I know the one you're gonna.
So, you know, whoops, first let me share here. Sorry.
I might have it. All right, you got it. Great.
Yeah, so this was in 2018. Some of you may remember it, when Melania Trump, without her husband, traveled to Kenya and I believe Tanzania and South Africa. And here she is in Kenya, and she's wearing full, what I think we could call colonial drag, for lack of a better word. You know, I mean, it was attacked immediately as incredibly, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, insensitive and tone deaf, I think is the word I'm looking for.
Well, right? I'm going to be less generous. I'm going to be less generous to say it's just such a lack of imagination to say, like, if I'm going to go to Africa, I need to, like, what do Western people wear when they go to Africa, right?
Yeah.
It's stepping into a role, right? You know,
very
and
much.
and I, you know, I don't even know how conscious Melania Trump was of that role, but it just seems like there are many people who have internalized this idea. I played the song, by the way, the song I played was Safari at the beginning, but I wanted to be clear, it was Safari by an African artist. But people who go on Safari would think, I got to get a pith helmet. This still continues to this day, right?
Very much. Yeah.
This notion. By the way, it does remind me, I want to just pull up one picture you had that I thought was absolutely fascinating, and that is that this idea goes back a long time. You mentioned that anybody who was going to travel to the colonies needed to get the pith helmet, but here we have, in that actual colonial exhibition of 1931, the sale of these, right, as spreading this idea. And, you know, people could, I imagine that for a brief while in Paris, people were walking around with pith helmets thinking that they looked really cool.
Yeah, I have I'm just looking here. Here's a quotation from 1931 in a newspaper. Some of these were French people who were a little bit skeptical about the sudden fad for the pith helmet. People were buying them like crazy in 1931 in Paris. The sun is not a problem, really, in Paris. So here's one quote: "The pith helmet is becoming fashionable. Our administrators aren't the only ones sporting the colonial style helmet. The candied fruit and bonbon sellers in Montparnasse are starting to wear the white helmet. One might ask oneself why, because in reality, wearing a pith helmet and selling candy at night, ... like this makes no sense. But all the self-respecting visitors to the exposition, it is said, must wear the pith helmet. It is literally selling like hotcakes." So that's a French commentator, right?
Like crêpe.
And then here's one more. I can't resist. I'm going to do one more.
Please.
Also from 1931, also a popular newspaper. "The other day in the Avenue of the Colonies," that is in the exposition itself. "The other day in the Avenue of the Colonies, across from the Somali Coast Pavilion, a brave man whose ears held up the pith helmet he'd purchased for 15 francs, which is now in style, walked around a well-dressed black man as if the latter were some sort of curious creature. Finally exclaiming, he says to this black man, 'So you happy come to Paris? Paris very pretty?' Impassive, the black man replied, I don't understand you, sir. Please have the courtesy to express yourself properly. You are speaking to the Undersecretary of State for the Colonies. So to me, that's very funny, you know, that the
Yeah,
white guy in the pith helmet who has not a
yeah,
clue, and speaks in this broken French to a
yeah,
black man who
yeah,
responds, but sir, you're a buffoon,
yeah.
essentially. So it's flipping things. It's like, you know, the
That's
inversion here. Who's got the pith helmet? Who's got the power? Who knows anything about the colonies, right?
very interesting. You know, I
Yeah.
want to be again a couple of topics I still want to get to. One is the turning this the story of the Pith Helmet on its edge. But before we get to that, you have some great slides in here of Marcel Griel's real fascination with headwear in
Mhm.
general. Can we talk about what it was that uh, how French colonialists and people like these ethnographers and what were looking at headwear in general among the colonies and why
Sure.
it was so important?
Well, this was one among many objects of fascination for Griol and other ethnographers, was the dress of the colonial subjects. This was a great obsession, right? And often considered to be nudity, but there was no nudity except among children. But this was sort of the discourse, which you've seen in some of the French representations. So I just point out here that though Griol and others in his group, he had a group of ethnographers, musicologists, and others around him, they focused on the headwear of the Dogon. The Dogon are an ethnic group, very important, still
Yep.
remaining very important ethnic group in Mali that he spent most of his time studying. And he claimed that he had understood through his interlocutors, through his informants, the deepest, most profound aspects of Dogon cosmology. And every single element of their lives, he said, was symbolic, and that included hats and clothing. So
Mhm.
this is in uh, a journal called Minotaur. I won't go into detail. This is Marcel Griol's first publication after returning from this famous expedition. And his first article is headed by this picture of a man named, he names here Tabillon, and his hat, right? You don't even see his face, you just see his hat. And then
Mhm.
this was more coverage of the return of this expedition. And again, hats feature prominently. It's almost strange when you begin to look at it. This is an article published by Griol's daughter, who was on the expedition, and she's talking about Dogon clothing, and she has this detailed diagram of all these hats, right? And yet, part of my point is, despite all this focus, nobody mentions the pith helmet. Nobody in
Yeah.
this group mentions anything official about the fact that the Dogon were also wearing pith helmets. That only appears in the unofficial
Mhm.
coverage. That is, I read you Michel Leary, who was the renegade. He
Yeah.
left the group. In fact, I'll just mention Michel Leary went on to become a major surrealist. He was in the
Mhm.
circle of uh, Picasso and Bataille and all these famous artists, and he went on to write many really esteemed works of literature. But he never was an ethnographer, right? He disavowed all of that. So it's only through him that we get this insight.
So I'm just as an aside, I just can't resist my own curiosity. Was did he go back to Paris and did he get involved with members of the Negritude movement, Senghor, Aimé
Yes, he
Césaire?
did.
Because
Yes, he did.
they were sort of involved with the surrealists as well. So that's
Yeah,
really
yeah,
interesting. So
yeah. No, he's a fascinating character. He's
I need to do
fascinating.
more on him. Thank you
Yeah,
for
yeah.
introducing me to him. Very interesting about so the hat that they were interested in hat, and there was an appropriateness. We're going to dialogue. We're going to look at all the different ways that they're going to wear these different headdresses. We're going to attach some symbolic meaning to it. We're going to read their culture and tell you that it matters that these has. Like, I'm just an aside about the Dogon people is that I know they were fascinated with the star Sirius, and there was some, this
Although,
one. Yeah,
that's
exactly.
it.
Right. I know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. How true. I know that there's or that's what was said about them. So was that entering into this whole cosmological discussion at that
Yeah.
point?
I
Yeah.
mean, what's so controversial is that at first Griol bullied the Dogon into serving as his ethnographic subjects. Then he kept going back and going back. And I will say in his favor, he did some very good things for the Dogon in terms of supporting French agricultural and irrigation projects and things. So many Dogon people would look back at him and say he did some good. But he also popularized this image of the Dogon, which remains today. If you Google Dogon, you will find some very strange stuff about aliens landing in West Africa, and that's how the Dogon learned what they learned, and so on.
Yeah.
But later in his career, he had one informant, one man, one elderly Dogon guy named Ogotameli, who sat with Griol, according to Griol, and revealed every secret of Dogon ritual and belief and mythology, which Griol published as a book called Conversations with Ogotameli. So a lot of the ideas that we have about the Dogon come from Griol, but interestingly, I've been to that region of Mali numerous times, and it's a big tourist, it was a big tourist site. Sadly, it is not now, not because of COVID, but because of other reasons, which I won't go into, but which I would love to talk about if people want. But
yeah, I know, I understand it's the area has become somewhat destabilized. And
very much, yeah. But people there who made their living from tourism, if you would take a tour, it wouldn't be at all unusual to see a beat up copy of one of Marcel Griol's books or articles about the Dogon as the source of information for the Dogon tour guide in Dogon country, which is a very interesting sort of cycle of how information moves and travels, right?
It's like a revealed truth that one person told him everything. And do we know the accuracy of everything that he told him?
No, not really. There's been a lot of critical work written, you know, re-examining Griol and his work. There is no one truth because, as it happens, I didn't mention this, but the Dogon live in a region in Mali which is very, very mountainous. It's full of cliffs. It's very famous for its dramatic landscapes. It's an amazing place. But because of that, there may be villages that have one system of thinking about leadership in the community. And because people, it's not easy to move around. That's part of the reason the Dogon originally went to this area, because they were fleeing Islamicization in the 15th and 16th centuries, right? So this is a long history. It's a long answer to your question, but just by way of saying, we can't say that Griol was simply wrong. We can say he was representing one community's vision.
There was this great desire in ethnography at the time to, well, classification and higher, you know, rationalization and classification, and to this positivist desire to like map it all out. And so, this is what the Dogon believe, and that's how they're different from the Bambara, and this is how we can rule, and it's all about in the service of rule, right? If you can begin to classify people and get to understand what they're about. We have some more pictures to get to, though, because there's so many files. I'm going to share the screen here because I'm going to just ask you what it was we were looking at and what we're looking for when we start to look at these pictures.
Well, this picture is not in French West Africa. It's a bit of an outlier, but I love the picture. It's from a newspaper that was aimed at French colonialists, right? There was a whole press that was just really aimed at covering the colonies for French people who worked or had interest in the colonies. So this is about Togo and Cameroon, which were French protectorates during the interwar period. So this is in the capital of Cameroon, Douala, and it is it's an article that's about the indigenous, the native would be the closest translation, and that is a loaded word. So I put scare quotes around it. The native consumer, right? And so it's aimed at giving French readers insights into what do they want to buy? What is the nature of consumerism in this colony? How can you take advantage of it? So this is a photo from that article, and it's called Douala à l'Européenne. It's Douala in European style or in a European fashion. And it has no information about it whatsoever. That's all I know. But I read this photograph in depth because I find it so fascinating. So we have walking toward us a woman and a man, right? The woman's walking toward us. She's wearing a very 1930s style French sort of international tailored fashion style of dress, a little cloche kind of a hat, a necklace of white pearly kind of beads. In other words, very European in style. Behind her is a man in a very sharp suit with a little trilby hat looking behind him. But the main character for me is the largest character, whose back is to us, who's dressed in jodhpurs, and he has what are those called again? I forget the name. Puttees. Wrapped around his leg is a kind of cloth that was sort of a British colonial in the Raj kind of style, right? An equestrian attire. He's carrying a cane and his hand is in his pocket, and on his head is this large pith helmet, right? I read this photograph as her, the woman, looking at him, right? And he is dressed to the nines. And the way he's holding his body, even, I read as self-possessed, you know, empowered kind of an individual. And this is a resident of Douala, right? I think that this photograph was meant to be read by French people as sort of the gall of these people wearing European style dress and promenading in the streets of Douala, of all places, the unpaved streets of Douala, of all places, wearing
with
this
white
attire.
stockings on, you know.
Yeah. So I find this to be one of the images that I can use to talk about the French response to their colonial subjects taking up the pith helmet.
I know I have some images here, and I'm going to just do a couple of these quickly because I do want to get to that artwork that you showed, and we're going to want to save a little bit of time for questions. But you know, this is the person on the left, of course, is famous, and this is Charles de Gaulle and Félix Owre, the first French general ever. You know, again, so here is this image. Clearly, he's a French general. He's able to wear the pith helmet without controversy. Is that how we should read this?
Yeah. Now, was he a general? He was a colonial official.
He was in fact a general. He was in the military as well. He was actually the first French officer of general rank who was black. He, of course, from the West Indies, I believe.
Right. He's from Guadeloupe, I think.
Guadeloupe, yeah.
But here he's serving as the administrator general of Chad, and he also was the administrator of Gabon. Yep. So he was quite high. And so these pictures make the point. And this is Gandalou Diouf, who was Senegalese, who was the official French delegate. He was the delegate to the French Parliament, representing Senegal, which had special status in the French colonial world. And it had its residents of certain parts of Senegal were citizens of the French,
the four
French
communes.
Citizens, not subjects. And in both cases, my point here is that they're wearing the pith helmet with the official sort of imprimatur of the French colonial administration. And then I have, let me just quickly, or do you want to put up, there's a slide that just has two quotes.
Next one. Here, we can just pull them up here. Why don't we pull them up? Boom, boom, boom. We have this one, or is it this one was the one after?
Well, actually, there's one that just has words on it, and it's quotes.
Oh, yeah. That's back here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So here, rather than images, because the French, there aren't many reproduced images of West Africans wearing pith helmets because it wouldn't have been something that the French would have publicized, except in the case of someone like Owre, who was doing it because he was a French official. So, but I have words instead that paint a picture. And this is from 1912, a description of life in Dakar, in this case. And this author is saying some West Africans, some natives, in scare quotes, wear turbans of blue cotton, some wear the fez, some caps in faded velvet. Others, seduced by the beauties of civilization, wear heterogeneous styles, workman's caps, even pith helmets, the supreme ambition of the urban native.
Wow.
Right. And there's a definite flavor to that language, right? Even pith helmets, the supreme ambition. And then if you click again, and then there's another here, 1928. Also, actually, the one on top is in Saint Louis, which is a city in Senegal. And then
one
in
of the
Dakar,
four communes.
Yeah, exactly. And then this French observer says, let us point out some sartorial particularities. The shirt is usually worn over the pants. I mean, how shocking, right?
Yeah.
Over the pants.
It's in fashion now, of course, but
Right, exactly. Pith helmets, he says, are never lost and always wind up on the head of a native who often feels the need to paint it. One of them had a periwinkle hue, another gave his a black coat of black paint, which is amazing and wonderful for me because that's the opposite of what the pith helmet is for. So to a French observer, it's like you've taken this hat that is made in white only because it
Mhm.
reflects the heat, and you painted it black so it will absorb the heat. So to me, that is a wonderful quote to make the point that
Yeah, it
this was
really,
absurd.
absolutely. And let's, I guess, I want to leave a little bit of time for some questions, but I think we might just jump right ahead then to the act, to sort of appropriation of the pith helmet in African art, and how this tell us what we're looking at here.
Yeah. So this is not French Africa. This would be British West
Uh-huh.
Africa, Nigeria. But I could bring in a million images that show you African artists depicting the pith helmet, usually sometimes as a way of depicting Europeans, often in a mocking manner.
Hmm.
This is a type of mask that's called a Galaday mask. That's an entertainment mask. And I look at this and I think this depicts a European looking
Yeah,
at the nose and looking at the color of the skin. So it
yeah.
might be somebody who was a bit of a comical character in the performance. And then if you go to the next one, this is from French West Africa, from Côte d'Ivoire. And this is a respectful, you might say, whereas the other was a bit mocking, portrayal of the pith helmet as in itself an object of power. This is a gold leaf covered wooden sculpture of a pith helmet that would have been placed on a shrine probably, right? And
Mm.
it's like a magnet for power, right? So it's saying we take this pith helmet, we make it into something else. It serves our needs in this context. So I find that very interesting too.
That's very fascinating. Do you find that in modern African artists, are they still intrigued by the pith helmet, and are they still taking it and making political statements out of it, or incorporating it into their own self-understanding in their art?
Well, I mean, maybe a little bit. It's a little less current now, but it's a good way to refer to the colonial past, right?
Uh-huh.
In a single image to sort of evoke the colonial past. I can't think of many artists who use it today, but some probably do.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, because again, I think many Africans are also saying, why do we always have to be self-referential to colonialism, right? What
absolutely,
exactly? Why do we
absolutely.
always have to have everything on your terms, and
Right,
our art has to be a
right,
reaction to your? So I can appreciate that, that
right,
it's,
right,
you don't need to have that appropriation of power right now, because actually Africa is moving in a totally different direction, and we
right,
can do
right,
art that represents our interests and whatnot.
right.
Well, Vicky, we've just totally only scratched the surface here. We have some images we didn't get to, but this is absolutely fascinating. I want to open up a few remaining minutes we have to some questions. And I'll start with Abby. And I want to just suggest anyone who's with us today, go ahead and put a question in the Q&A section right there. Abby asked, was there an equivalent recommended hat for ladies?
Ladies wore the pith helmet. Good question. And I have some great descriptions of how women adorned their pith helmets to match the rest of their ensemble. So women would drape scarves on the pith helmet. They never painted it. I don't have any evidence of that. But it's a good question. Women wore it, but I've seen nothing of West African women wearing the pith helmet. It
Mhm.
seems I'm finding only references to men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's also interesting. I mean, just throwing the gendered aspect of it, there is always this sort of homosocial aspect to men going out into the colonies, and this is like the man's world. And then, we see these, like you said, out of Africa, whenever we have depictions of European women I mean, not whenever, but more often than not, European women are sort of put out there, and they're especially exoticized because they're in a world of French men and Africans, and it gives this really interesting gendered perspective that the European, and I think that's why that romanticism of Isaac Denison and some of those others who
Yeah.
write in that style were so resonant, perhaps with female audiences in Europe as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
have you ever seen the French film? Not the one with what Johnny Depp or whatever. It's just Chocolat, about the
Mhm.
the woman who's, again, there you have that sort of sense, woman out in the middle of nowhere. It's a wonderful film, same name as the more famous Chocolat, where you have just a relationship of what it was like to be a woman out in these Cercle, as they call them, way out in the middle of
I
nowhere.
think that was in Gabon.
Gabon,
Not
yeah,
sure. Yeah. Yeah,
fascinating.
that's a very good movie. Yeah.
Very good movie. So a powerful film. If anyone is interested, I would, again, if I were as good as Paul, I would be going and putting a link to it in there. But I'll steer you to it. We're not talking about the Julia Binoche. Maybe might have been in the other one. We're not talking about that. Chocolat. It's a French film. Check it out. It's very powerful. I have a question here about are there any articles of clothing that are similar that you can talk about that are so loaded with, I mean, I think Jogpers themselves make me think also of Nazis, to be frank, right? So what other elements of clothing do you think of that associate, maybe even positive positive associations? Can you think of other pieces of clothing that are powerful like this?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of West African clothing styles, there's a rich sort of history and diversity of dress that is very specific in its references to power, which interestingly Europeans never took up, but they could have if they really wanted to look powerful, like what hunters wear in different parts of West Africa is this wonder. I teach about it a lot because it's so dramatic. It's clothing that even if you don't know what you're looking at, it's about power, where shirts and tunics are laden with amulets and symbols and packets of powerful ingredients. In terms of European dress, the top hat has a really rich history in Africa, where there are wonderful photographs from the turn of the century in Ghana and Togo, where you have chiefs and other people wearing the top hat as symbols of power. So hats are interesting.
It's interesting you say that about the top hat in general, because this is a European phenomenon as well. I mean, I often show when I'm teaching French history courses, maybe looking at a Belle Epoque picture of a crowd, and I said, everyone knows who everyone is immediately. The top hats are the gentlemen and the high bourgeoisie. The bowler hats are the middle class, lower middle class, and the workman's floppy caps are the workers.
Yeah.
And so hats are powerful in and of themselves, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So I also, just one other question, because we mentioned this in our preliminary discussion. I often associate the French colonialism with the képi, the kind of square cap like that, and often the French Foreign Legion, which had the protective drape behind it, and the British with the pith helmet. Does the kepi have any power associations with it, like the pith helmet?
Not as much from what I can see. Yeah, I mean, in terms of how do I judge that? I mean, I don't see many representations of the kepi on the West African side.
Yeah, right.
So that's interesting.
So the West Africans aren't appropriating the kepi for the same reason, not saying like, yeah.
And one last thing to mention, very famous French filmmaker Jean Rouch, Jean Rouch?
Sure.
He made a movie called, it's in the English translation, The Mad Masters. It's about a possession cult, for lack of a better word, in Niger, where people from Niger are possessed by spirits. And one of the main spirits that possesses them is a colonial figure. So in his film, and it's a documentary, it's real what he's showing you, people are possessed by this colonial spirit. And what marks that? It's the pith helmet that they wear, right? So it really does sort of, it has a great power, a great symbolic power. Yeah.
Well, I think this has been great fun. I think it was absolutely success. Our first biography of an object. We'll do more of these. Vicki, you are always welcome to come and talk about your work anytime with us. I hope we can find some other forums for you to do that. And please, what will be the future for this work for you? It's obviously a work in progress right now. What are your plans?
It's part of a book project, and most of the book is about cotton and cotton cloth, but this is a chapter on the pith helmet. Yeah.
And the pith helmet was often covered with cotton.
That's true.
Yeah, true. There you go. So there's a tie-in.
It works.
Well, I want to thank you so much. Stay safe. I hope to see you in 3D soon enough.